Vronsky.
Hello and welcome. I am Sir Shudder. Before we begin, if you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe and hit the notifications icon to see when I've done another video. This video is going to be about Albert Desalvo, the Boston Strangler. There has recently been some serious controversy as to whether Albert Desalvo really was the Boston Strangler in 2000. The families of Desalvo and Mary Sullivan, his purported last victim, jointly exhumed her body and conducted DNA tests on the trace material recovered from her corpse. The material, appearing to be traces of seminal fluid buried with the body for 40 years, did not match the DNA pattern taken from Desalvo's surviving brother. But the testing was privately done and has not so far been changed. The state of position that Desalvo indeed the confessed Boston Strangler. There are some conflicting reports as to whether Desalvo's brother is willing to cooperate with authorities in a state-sponsored DNA test. If not the deeds, then at least the canonical story of Albert Desalvo, who allegedly murdered 13 women between 1962 and 1964, capped in the industrial age of serial murder, ushered us forward into the new Ted Bundy epoch. Despite numerous cases of serial killings and around the world since 1888, Jack the Ripper held his place as the worst in popular memory until the early 1960s. But in 1962, his primacy was shaken by the Boston Strangler, at least in the United States. Like Jack the Ripper, the Boston Strangler focused on a very small killing ground. He killed in so-called lace-curtain neighborhoods of Boston's lower middle-class districts. His victims lived among the dense rows of the inexpensive low-rise apartment buildings. This type of focused killing had the effects of terrorizing the city, and as the press pronounced each new victim of the Boston Strangler, his reputation became legendary. After his confession in the days before made-for-TV movies, Hollywood chose him as a subject worthy of a film. 20th Century Fox's The Boston Strangler starred Tony Curtis as the killer and Henry Fonda as the detective who pursued him. While many know the moniker Boston Strangler, few remember the name of the man behind it, Albert Desalvo. Albert Henry Desalvo was born in September 3rd, 1931, in Chelsea, Massachusetts. His mother, Charlotte, came from the old respectable Yankee family. Her father was an officer in the Boston Fire Department. Charlotte was 15 when she married Albert's father, Frank Desalvo. A brutal alcoholic delinquent, 69% of serial killers in the FBI study report a history of alcohol abuse in the family. The father was arrested 18 times. 50% of serial killers had a parent with a criminal background. Desalvo's description of his childhood is horrendous. His earliest childhood memories are of his father beating his mother. He witnessed him once knocking her tooth and breaking her finger. Desalvo said that he himself was beaten severely by his father and once sold to a farmer in Maine along with his two sisters for $9. 42% of sexual murders report physical abuse in childhood. After 6 months, his mother found them when Albert was 12 years old, his father was jailed, and afterwards his mother divorced him. 47% of serial killers report their father leaving before age 12. The historiography of serial murder is inconsistent. Often descriptions of cases are written quickly and focus upon more lurid aspects of events, attention to detail, authenticity, and the fact is minimal, and defensive case information is often looked up in inaccessible police archives. Such is the case of the question of Albert's relationship with his mother. Dr. James A. Brussel, a renowned criminal psychiatrist who interviewed Desalvo, wrote in 1968, "The mother," Albert said, "was not the warm and loving woman who might have made his life tolerable. She was, at best, indifferent to the boy. She was out of the house most nights. There was no home life. She didn't stop the nightly beatings." On the other hand, DeSalvo's biographer, Frank Gerald, wrote that Albert was his mother's favourite. He had 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and that, as an adult, he would visit his mother as often as possible. Like 71% of serial killers in the FBI study, Albert felt isolated in his childhood. "I never allowed myself to get close to anyone. Maybe I wasn't able. I recall I used to run away as a kid. I hid out in a junkyard. There was a dog there, Queenie, tough, bit everyone. Maybe I was looking for affection, but I slept with the dog night after night, and it never bit me." According to Dr. Brussel, Albert's father used to bring prostitutes home, and the children witnessed him having sex with them. 30% of serial killers report witnessing disturbing parental sex acts. When Albert was 5 or 6, he and his brothers and sisters began attempting sex acts. The circumstances of Albert and his sisters being sold to a farmer by their father are unclear. Albert never talked about what happened during the 6 months they were there. Albert claims that he began to have steady sex at age 8 with girls and women, and that he prostituted himself to homosexuals. Some of them was amazed at how I come, and then 5 minutes later come again. The queers loved that they would pay for it too, which was all right with me since I needed the dough. There was some relief from the urge that was pushing me to sex all the time, but it really was women that I wanted, not any special one, just a woman with what a woman was, not just to come, but to have the breasts and the body to play with, to bite and kiss, then to go into. Didn't even care so much what she looked like, how old she was. It was a woman, and not a pretty woman or any special woman, but a woman that I wanted even then. Like 36% of sex killers in the FBI study, DeSalvo tortured animals when he was a child. Like 81% of his surveyed killers, DeSalvo began to steal in early adolescence. At the age of 12, he was sentenced for burglary to 10 months in the Lyman School for Boys, a reformatory in Boston. His IQ was tested at the time, recorded as 93, low average. DeSalvo said that a reformatory one can learn about every form of sexual perversion. Just as with serial killers Ed Kemper and Henry Lee Lucas and thousands of other young men, Early incarceration of Desalvo served to better educate him in criminal techniques and expose him to darker frontiers of aberrant sexuality. Once he was released from Lyman, Desalvo began to commit a flurry of burglaries. Never getting caught, there was a distinct sexual character to his burglaries. Desalvo said, "There was something exciting, thrilling about going into somebody's home. I think now, too, that I had something to do with going into the bedrooms where women had slept, or where they were sleeping, and there was times when I would get a rail erection on just standing there outside the bedroom door listening to some woman breathe." So you see, the urge was all part of this, and it was only a matter of time before I would feel strong enough and tough enough to go into the bedroom where a woman was there and make her let me do what I wanted with her. Once again, there was a weak historiography on the Albert Desalvo school years. Dr. Brussels describes Desalvo as a model pupil who pleased his teachers by cheerfully running errands for them and getting them coffee and sandwiches. Desalvo told him, "I bawled my way through. I always tried to be tops, like in book sales, on where you got recognition or a certificate for doing something. I was always number one. Teachers knew I was doing my schoolwork properly. I actually had no schooling. I was jealous. I was looking for recognition." Earl James, however, in his police manual on the apprehension of serial killers, wrote, "Albert Desalvo began school when he was 6 years old. During his early school years, he suffered from some medical problems. He had tonsillitis and some other childhood diseases. Because of these illnesses, he missed a great deal of school. He failed second grade and was put into a special education class when he was in the 5th grade. In 1948, at age 16, Desalvo graduated from junior high school. His teachers there have no memory of him. Desalvo went to work on Cape Cod as a dishwasher in a motel. He spent most of his free time on a roof watching couples through windows. As with many serial killers, his first sexual aberration was ostensibly a minor one, voyeurism. In September 1948, when he turned 17, Desalvo enlisted in the army and was sent to Germany. In the military, Desalvo apparently did well. He was trained as a military policeman, achieved the rank of sergeant, and was made colonel orderly 27 times. He also discovered that he had abilities as a boxer and became US Army middleweight champion of Europe twice. Desalvo also claimed that he had numerous affairs with officers' wives and that he practiced bondage with some of them. Desalvo said that he was sought out by women and offered money or jewelry for his stud services. He claims that while he was able to satiate his growing sexual appetite, he was seeking love of his life. In 1953, now 22 years old, Desalvo married a pretty German girl from Frankfurt named Irmgard. He was intensely in love with her, but she was not a good match for his sexual appetite. Desalvo recalled that she was innocent and scared of sex because of her strict family upbringing. He said he needed to have sex 5 or 6 times a day, often immediately after just having sex. She did not like it. She did, he said, and he used to constantly ask himself what was wrong with him. In April 1954, Desalvo returned to the United States with his bride. He was stationed at Fort Dix, New Jersey. In December 1954, about 9 p.m., Desalvo knocked at the door of a house where there was a woman whose husband was working night shift. Desalvo told her that he was driving by her house and saw a prowler looking through the window. She allowed him into the house to look around, but then became suspicious when Desalvo began to ask when her husband would be coming home. She locked herself into another room. Desalvo left the house and sat in his car parked in her driveway. The woman wrote down his license plate number. Tracing the license plate, New Jersey State Police questioned Desalvo several days later. Desalvo told them he was driving around looking for a place to rent when he saw a prowler at the woman's house and had only wanted to help. There was nothing to charge Desalvo with, and no further action was taken. On January 3rd, 1955, at about 2 p.m, a young mother went out to do some quick food shopping and left her 9-year-old daughter and 2 younger brothers alone. When she returned, the daughter told her that a soldier had come by for the rent. Since the family owned the house, this struck the mother as strange. On further questioning, the girl said the soldier had felt and touched her chest and genital areas. When the New Jersey State Police were called, they immediately remembered the soldier that they had questioned just a few days earlier. The little girl and her brothers identified him. Desalvo was charged with carnal abuse of a child and released on £1,000 bond. The case, however, never went to trial because the mother did not want her daughter to go through the trauma of testifying. All charges were subsequently dropped. It was the period of 1955 that Imgard gave birth to Desalvo's daughter, Judy. She was born with deformity of the legs that required special braces, locking her limbs into a frog-like position. Desalvo tenderly massaged the legs of his daughter and tried to give them the braces more cheerful character by trying pretty coloured bows on them. Perhaps because of the sex crime charges, or perhaps because of the birth of a crippled child, Irmgard withdrew from Desalvo further, referring to his murdering and having stolen life. Desalvo wrote to his wife years later while in prison, "You will admit that if you treated me differently, like you told me all those years we lost, the love I had been searching for, that we first had when we were married, yes, I stole them, but why? What happened when Judy was born, and why? And we found out she may never walk. How you cried, Al, please, no more babies. From that day you changed. All your love went to Judy. You were frigid and cold to me, and you can't deny this. That's why we were always fighting about sex, because you were afraid to have a baby, because you thought it would be born abnormal." In 1956, Albert Desalvo received an honourable discharge from the US Army. It was unclear whether he left the Army as his own choice, or whether the charges in New Jersey had something to do with it. He returned to live in Chelsea with his wife and daughter, and was arrested there in 1958 for a minor burglary. In 1959, a son Michael was born. Desalvo worked in the shipyard as a labourer to support his family. Desalvo recalls attempting to lead a conventional life, being a provider for his family, but always being overpowered by his compulsions in the end. He said he was trying to bring out the best in himself, yet the sickness was always with him, forcing him to go out and do things I knew was wrong. In 1960, Desalvo began committing a series of almost comical sex offences in Boston district of Cambridge. Posing as a talent scout for a modelling agency, Desalvo asked women for permission to measure them. While wrapping his measure around their bust and hips, he would touch and fondle them. Many women did not even notice Desalvo's touch complaints started to be filed with the police from angry women only when they realized that no photographer was coming to shoot their pictures. Desalvo became known as the Measuring Man in March 1961. Police observed Desalvo breaking into a house in Cambridge and arrested him. Desalvo confessed that before he was caught, he tried to break into an apartment where he had previously measured two women. He said he wanted to break into their apartment and wait for them to come home. Asked why, Desalvo said nothing further. Desalvo was charged with the lewdness, assault and battery, attempted breaking and entering, confining and putting in fear, and engaging in an unnatural and lascivious sex act. He was convicted of only assault and battery and attempted breaking and entering. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison, and his term was reduced to 11 months for good behaviour. After he had committed the murders, Desalvo commented on his Measuring Man activities. Mostly I got a big kick out of those girls around Harvard. I'm not good looking, I'm not educated, but I was able to put something over a high class people. I know that they look down on people who come from my background. They think that they are better than me. They was college kids, and I never had anything in my life. I outsmarted them. I was supposed to feel that they was better than me because they was college people. When I told them that they could be models, that was like saying the same thing. You are better than me. You are better than anybody. You can be a model. Anybody with any sense could have found out. They never asked for me for proof. There was times when I was doing the Measuring Man thing that I hated them girls for being so stupid, and I wanted to do something to them. Something that would make them think, even for a little while, that would let them know that I was as good as they was, maybe better and smarter. Desalvo had been given psychiatric examination at Bridgewater Mental Hospital, and it was recommended that he put into psychiatric unit instead of prison. It might have worked in this case because it appears that Desalvo was aware of his compulsions and sincerely wanted to be free of them. When Desalvo was in jail, he told the psychiatrist of his slavish love for Imgard. I can hardly wait to get out. I can be with her and treat her the way a wife should be treated, even if it means washing her feet. But when he got home, Imgard rejected him totally. She said that he was dirty and sickening and called him an animal. 2 months after his release from prison, Albert Desalvo left his house on June 14, 1962, telling his wife he was going fishing. Instead, he ended up wandering into a low-rise apartment complex with scaffolding outside. He knocked on doors at random until Anna Slezers, a 50-year-old woman of Latvian descent, came to her door. She appeared younger than her age and had brown, bobbed hair. She was trained in Latvia as an agronomist, but in America she worked as a seamstress. Desalvo told Slezers he was from a work crew and that some repairs were going to be done in her apartment. She let him in. Slezers was later found lying on her back on a runner near the door to the bathroom. She was wearing a blue robe which was spread open, exposing her nude body. Her legs were spread wide apart, her left leg bent at the knee. She had been struck on the head and there was a quantity of blood underneath her head. She was strangled with a cord of her robe, which was strangely tied around her neck with a bow underneath her chin. Although she appeared to have been raped, no seminal fluids were found in her vagina or at the scene. Her wastebasket was missing and its contents were strewn on the floor. Drawers had been pulled open and some of her contents thrown on the floor. The police assumed that the murderer entered the premises to commit a burglary and was discovered by the victim, who was then struck, raped and killed by the burglar. Desalvo said that after killing Slezers, he went into the bathroom to wash up. He remembers that he was wearing gloves. He ransacked the apartment and took $20 he found in the cabinet. He later would say that was the only time he ever stole something from his victims. Other than their lives, he removed his bloodied jacket and shirt, and after dumping the contents of the wastebasket, put his garments in it. He turned off the record player, put on a raincoat he found hanging by the door, and walked out carrying the wastebasket. He walked by a police car on patrol, got into his car, drove away. A woman and that her husband had... He stopped a man on the street and told him he was having an affair with a woman and that her husband had caught him. He had to run away without his shirt. Would the man mind accompanying him to a store that he could buy a shirt in case there were any problems with him walking in without a shirt? The man agreed. Afterward, Desalvo went to the ocean, tore the bloodied garments into strips and dumped them in the surf. He then went home to have supper with his wife and kids. Desalvo described a tranquil, trance-like state after he killed. It was like it was all the same thing, always the same feeling. You was there, these things were going on, and the feeling after I got out of the apartment was as if it never happened. I got out and downstairs, and you could have said you saw me upstairs. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't me. I can't explain to you any other way. It's just so unreal. I was there, it was done, and yet, if you talked with me an hour later, or half an hour later, it didn't mean nothing. It just didn't mean nothing. Desalvo's first murder was highly proficient. He wore gloves and left no fingerprints behind. He parked his car a distance away from where he committed the murder. He quickly disposed of the bloodied clothing, and he engaged a stranger who could later testify to an alibi if he had been caught that day. His training as a military policeman was paying off. 2 weeks later, on June 28, 1962, Desalvo knocked on the door of 85-year-old Mary Mullen. He told her he had been sent to do some work on her apartment. She inevitably let him in. It should have been noted that all the victims of the Boston Strangler lived in economical low-rise apartments, which were almost always in need of some sort of repair. Whenever Desalvo called to say he had been sent to do repair work or repainting it, it always made perfect sense to the tenants. When Mary Mullen turned her back on Desalvo, he wrapped his arm around her throat. She apparently died instantly, because perhaps of heart failure. Desalvo laid her out on the couch and left. When her body was discovered, authorities declared her death as being of natural causes. It was only after Desalvo confessed to the authorities realised Mary Mullen was a victim of the Boston Strangler. On June 30th, Saturday, Desalvo told his wife he had to go out on a job early in the morning. He drove around aimlessly until he arrived at an apartment building in Newall Street in Lynn, where he had been before in measuring man days. He randomly knocked on the apartment door of the second floor. Helen Blake, aged 65, answered the door, still wearing her pajamas. Using his usual approach, Desalvo told her he needed to check her windows for leaks. Just before he entered, Desalvo picked up some milk bottles left by the door and handed them to Blake. He handled them carefully so as not to leave any fingerprints. In the bedroom, as they inspected the windows, Desalvo grabbed Blake from behind and choked her. She fainted quickly. Holding her with one hand, he carefully took her glasses off and set them down. He laid her down on the bed, took off her pajamas and raped her with a foreign object. He tied a nylon stocking around her bra and her bra tightly around her neck and strangled her. He then looped the garments into a bow, which he tied under her chin. This bow would become a signature of the Boston Strangler. Asked why he tied the bow, Desalvo simply replied, "I don't know." Some analysis speculated that the bow was somehow connected to the bows he tied around the orthopedic braces of his crippled daughter, but the connection is tenuous. Desalvo killed his fourth victim later the same day. He drove into Boston, randomly chose an apartment, and began pressing buzzer buttons that had women's names on the address plates. Nina Nichols, age 68, was talking to her sister on the phone when Desalvo buzzed. Her sister heard the buzzer, and Nina told her that she would call her right back. She never called back. Nina Nichols was found posed on the floor, her legs spread wider apart, facing the entryway. Her pink housecoat slip were pushed up to her waist, and her two stockings were tied around her throat in the bow under her chin. She had been raped with a wine bottle. Seminal fluid was found on her tights. The apartment appeared to have been burglarized, with things strewn around, the drawers pulled out. The desk drawer was pulled out and placed on the floor, as if the killer carefully examined all the contents: stationery, stamps, pens, paper clips. Nothing, however, was found to be missing. Asked what he was looking for, Desalvo again replied, "I don't know. I didn't have any idea of taking anything." When Desalvo was confessing to Nina's murder, he said that she had scratched him when he was strangling her, and the police must have found his skin under her fingernails. This revealed the extent to which Desalvo was familiar with police investigative techniques. At this point, the police became aware that there was a multiple killer on the loose who had murdered 3 women. A 4th victim was thought to have died of natural causes. On August 19, 1962, Desalvo murdered 25-year-old Ida Erger. She was found on her back on the living room floor wearing a light night dress that had been torn open, exposing her body. Her legs were spread wide open and her feet propped up in individual chairs. A pillow was placed beneath her buttocks and she was pointed in the direction of the door, so the sight of her exposed genitals would greet whoever would enter the apartment. A white pillowcase was tightly knotted around her throat. The posing of the victim had now become complex, but when Desalvo was questioned about it, he could only say, "I just did it." Within a day or two, Desalvo killed his 6th victim, 67-year-old Jane Sullivan. The precise date of her murder is unclear. As her body was not discovered until August 30th, some 10 days after the murder, she was found in the bathtub in a kneeling position. Her face was beneath about 6 inches of water and her bare buttocks were exposed. Her cotton house coat had been pulled up over her shoulder and her girdle was pushed around above her waist. Her underwear was down around her ankles. She was strangled with her own nylon stockings. The victim had been killed in another room and then taken into the bathroom and posed. Such posing is a sign of that the FBI describes as disorganized personality of serial killer. Often, the posing of the victim was obscure, with some obscure meaning known only to the perpetrator. Desalvo's random targeting of apartment buildings also is a mark of disorganized offender, as is his frequent use of weapons found at the crime scene, articles of clothing. At the same time, however, Desalvo carried gloves with him, took meticulous care never to leave any fingerprints, and talked his way into the victim's apartment, all characteristics of an organized personality. Desalvo was the rare creature defined as a mixed personality killer, both predictable and unpredictable at the same time. A homicide investigator's worst nightmare. It made Desalvo a unique case in forensic history, and Desalvo was now about to go a step further. After committing 6 homicides in the period of 2 months, Desalvo suddenly stopped killing for 4 months. Then on December 5th, 1962, he murdered Sophie Clark. A victim defied the odds. She was black and 20 years old. It was rare for sexual murderer to cross racial lines. Usually, white kills whites, black kills blacks, and so forth. Even more rare was that, having established a consistent pattern by murdering 6 elderly women, Desalvo suddenly murdered a 20-year-old. It caused havoc in the investigation, as detectives became divided on the issue of whether there was one killer or 2 different stranglers. Today, the question is still being pondered about Desalvo. December 5th was Desalvo's wedding anniversary, and that might have triggered the killing again. Desalvo gained entry into Sophie Clark's apartment using the usual repairman routine. He said, "I gave her fast talk. I told her I'd set her up in modelling. I'd given her $20 to $30 on an hour. He then asked her to turn around so he could get a better look at her figure. As she turned her back to him, he grabbed her around the throat with his arm. Clark was found on the living room rug. 3 of her nylon stockings were tied around her neck, as was also her white slip and belt. A gag was stuffed into her mouth. She was on her back, her bathrobe open, and she was naked except for a pair of black stockings, a garter and a loafer. Shoes. Her legs were spread wide open and her bra had been ripped from her during the attack. A sanitary napkin was tossed under the chair nearby. Her glasses were broken. Seminal fluid was found in her vagina. After Desalvo killed her, he remained behind in the apartment leafing, though her magazines and record collection. Then, without taking anything, he quietly slipped out. Sophie Clark's apartment was 2 blocks away from Anna Sleezer's, his first victim. On December 31st, 1962, Desalvo killed his 7th victim, 23-year-old Patricia Bissett. Again, Desalvo defied the odds. The victim was found in her bedroom, lying face up on her bed, her legs together and covered by a bedspread snugly drawn up to her chin. Diametrically opposite to the grotesque and humiliating posing that he had committed previously, a victim who was found covered this way often reflects a sense of guilt or remorse in the killer. Later, Desalvo said, "She was so different. I didn't want to see her like that, naked. She talked to me like a man. She treated me like a man." Desalvo had knocked on her door pretending to be somebody who lived upstairs, looking for one of her roommates. He had already gotten the names from the mailbox below. Bissett invited him in to wait, made some coffee. Desalvo said she was nice to him, treating him like a man, and that he talked himself out of hurting her. He tried to find an excuse to leave her apartment and offered to go and get some donuts, but Bissett said that it was unnecessary. Desalvo said that at that moment he knew he did not want to happen what happened. Despite his fuzzy, warm sentiments for Bissett, he raped and strangled her with her stockings, leaving them tied what by then the police called the Strangler's bow. Desalvo had this to say about Bissett's murder: "I don't know if I done this for the sex act or hatred of for what reason. I think I did this not as a sex act, but out of hate for her. Not her in particular, but for women. I don't think that a sex act is anything to do with it. It is what anybody does from the top of the bottom of the world. But that is not what I mean. It is one thing to do it when a woman wants you to do it, and another when she don't. You understand me? If women do not want you to do what is right and natural, then it is dirty. Then they don't. You are really an animal if you do it just the same, is what I mean, you see? But all I can say is that when I saw the body, the sex act came in. I did not enjoy the sexual recollections of this woman. I was thinking too much about she would not have wanted me to do it. There was no thrill at all. For once, Desalvo had come up with some valuable insight into his motives. Rape and other sex crimes are rarely committed out of the desperate lack of sex. Bundy was an attractive man with many girlfriends, and Desalvo was able to seduce countless women, yet both used extreme violence in compelling the victims into sex acts. In such cases, the sexual act is merely a component of the aggressive impulse. Sex and rape are used as a weapon to batter the victim, and not for the purpose of sexual gratification. Many cannot understand why an individual would rape a 75-year-old woman, because they cannot imagine such a woman as sexually attractive. In fact, however, sexual attractiveness or desire has nothing to do with it. It is purely aggressive and hateful act against the victim. Likewise, in prison, male-on-male rape has less to do with homosexual desire than aggressive dominance. Very few prison rapists are homosexuals. On February 18, 1963, Desalvo gained entry into the apartment of a 29-year-old woman. She was sick with the flu, and at first didn't want to let him in. He told her he was from the construction crew working on the roof, and that he needed to shut her water off. Indeed, there was a crew working on the roof, and the woman finally let him enter. When he grabbed her, however, she bit his finger down to the bone and began desperately screaming. Desalvo ran away, but the victim could not come forth with a usual description. By now, the police were in a frenzy and were meticulously checking every sex offender released from prison and mental hospitals in the last 2 years. Unfortunately, Desalvo had been convicted of assault and battery and breaking and entry, and therefore his name did not appear on the list of sexual offenders. On March the 9th, 1963, Desalvo killed his 9th victim, 69-year-old Mary Brown. On his way into her building, he picked up a piece of brass pipe. Once he gained entry into her apartment, he struck her with the pipe. He then ripped her dress open, exposing her breasts. He picked up a sheet, threw it over her head, and then battered her skull with the pipe. Afterward, he picked up a fork and thrust it into her breast. On May the 5th, 1963, he killed 23-year-old Beverly Sammons. She was found lying on her back on a convertible sofa bed. She was nude except for a lace blouse draped around her shoulders, and her legs were spread apart. Her wrists were tied behind her, and she was gagged. A nylon stocking and 2 handkerchiefs were knotted around her neck. Again, Desalvo surprised the police with his versatility. Beverly Sammons was stabbed more than 20 times. Beverly Sammons, who was partially deaf, was a month away from getting her master's degree in rehabilitation and counselling. In her typewriter was her thesis titled Factors Pertaining to the Etiology of Male Homosexuality. For some reason, perhaps because of the bite he had received from his previous victim, Desalvo did not grab Sammons by the throat or behind. Instead, he drew his knife and confronted her face to face. Sammons tried to put her counselling education into practice to save her life. She attempted to negotiate with Desalvo, agreeing to let him play around with her, but no intercourse. When Desalvo began to rape her anyway, she complained to him that he had exceeded the agreed upon limit. Desalvo became enraged because, he said, she began to remind him of his wife, with whom making love was like asking a dead dog to move. Desalvo said Sammons made him feel unclean and unwanted, making matters worse. Because Sammons was partially deaf, but Desalvo did not know, she could not hear all of his instructions. He became enraged when no matter how hard he tried to please her, his victim complained and struggled. Enraged, he stabbed her 20 times. On September 8, 1963, Desalvo killed his 11th victim, 58-year-old Evelyn Corbin. He arrived at her door after trying several other apartments and failing to find a suitable victim. Desalvo told her that the superintendent had sent him to check on her for leaks in her windows. At first, she wouldn't let him in. Often in such cases, Desalvo used a clever twist of psychology. Well, if you don't want the work done, I'll go. It's your apartment. Like all the others, Corbin eventually opened the door to Desalvo. Once inside, Desalvo drew his knife and put it to her neck. He said that the first thing she asked was, "You're not the Boston Strangler, are you?" Desalvo assured her he was not and took her into the bedroom. Corbin told Desalvo that she was not well and could not have intercourse. Desalvo sat down on the edge of the bed and had Corbin kneel before him on a pillow on the floor and perform oral sex. Desalvo then told her that he was going to tie her up and leave. He made her promise to give him time to go and not to make a sound. He tied her hands in front of her and laid her down on the bed. He then stuffed a pair of panties in her mouth, straddled her body, sitting on her hands, and placed a pillow over her face, and strangled her with his hands. Finally, he took some nylon stockings from her drawer and tied them in a bow, and spread her legs open and in a 45-degree angle, and tied her another bow around the victim's left ankle. On November 24th, 1963, while most of America had come to a halt because of the assassination of President Kennedy 2 days previously, Desalvo killed his 12th victim, 23-year-old Joan Graff. Despite the fact that his victim was very wary and would not even permit the landlord to enter her apartment, Desalvo talked his way in. Graff was found lying in at a diagonal across the bed, with her legs spread apart. She was strangled. 2 nylon stockings were intertwined with the victim's black leotard tied in a bow around her neck. Desalvo said that afterward he drove home, washed up, played with the kids, had supper, and watched television. The murder of Lee Harvey Oswald was broadcast live on network TV that day. On January the 4th, 1964, police found Desalvo's 13th and last victim, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan. She was found on her bed in a propped up position. Under her buttocks was a pillow. Her back rested against the headboard and her head was resting on her right shoulder. Seminal fluid was dripping from her mouth onto her right breast. Both of her breasts were exposed. Her knees were bent and raised and her legs spread apart. A broomstick handle was inserted into her vagina. There were seminal stains on the blanket. A stocking was tied tightly around her throat and covered by a scarf tied in a large bow. Next to the victim's left toes was placed a greeting card, "Happy New Year." The Boston Strangler was finished. Desalvo now took on a new persona, the Green Man, wearing green work pants and a shirt. He broke and entered into women's apartments and tied them up and raped them. Often he ejaculated as soon as he tied them up and touched them, and did not have intercourse. He apologized to the victim and loosened her bindings before he left. In the 11 months during which he committed his Green Man attacks, Desalvo never killed any of his victims. On November the 3rd, 1964, a detective recognized the victim's description of the Green Man as being similar to the Measuring Man. Desalvo's mugshots were shown as the victim, and she quickly identified Desalvo as the Green Man. Desalvo was arrested and held at Brigwater Mental Hospital. The police had no idea that they had the Boston Strangler in their custody because so many victims were elderly women. Police were looking for a mother hater, somebody who was still living with a domineering mother. Desalvo's psychiatric prison records indicated that he had a good and loving relationship with his mother, despite Brussels' assertion that she was indifferent to Albert. It was only in the spring of 1965, while still in custody, that Desalvo began making his confessions. The police realized that they had the Boston Strangler in the custody for 6 months already. Desalvo made a deal with authorities. He would plead guilty to the Green Man rapes and take a life sentence if no murder charges would be brought against him as the Boston Strangler. Thus is the end. Nobody was officially charged or convicted for the 13 murders. Many in the law enforcement community were unconvinced that Desalvo was the killer. They pointed out Desalvo did not need to kill for sex because he was adept at both seducing and raping females. The problem is that it is only an outdated notion that offenders rape for sex. In fact, rape is as much as seduction or killing could have easily been a question of control or rage for Desalvo, not sex. The question remains, however, why did Desalvo kill? And more important, why did he stop on his own? Psychiatrist James Brussel was brought in from New York by Boston police prior to Desalvo's capture, as were several other psychiatrists. Brussel had been successful at profiling other killers' personalities by studying his crimes. The panel of psychiatrists Brussel recalls were all deeply divided as to the personality of the killer. A faction insisted that there were two different killers. He was probably suffering from impotency at the conference after the murder of Mary Sullivan. Brussel recalls that he felt very uneasy, as if the solution were at the tip of his fingers, yet eluding him. Brussel heard one of the psychiatrists say, "And this trail of semen ranging from the thighs of every victim to the mouth of the most recent could hardly have been left by a single man." He suddenly came to the solution, Brussel states, by following the trail of semen. Figuratively, Brussel concluded that over the 2-year killing period, Desalvo was psychosexually maturing, passing from puberty to manhood in his most monstrous way. Brussel noted that Desalvo's first 5 victims, elderly women, were not raped but manipulated or penetrated by a foreign object. Brussel saw this as sexually typical of a small boy coveting his mother's love and curious about her body, and by association the bodies of the women in general. But with the alleged abuse of his mother's love, Desalvo expressed his longings with rage. Thus his murder and molestation of his first 5 victims. Then, after a 4-month hiatus, he turned his attention to younger women and girls. According to Brussels, Desalvo was in a stage now resembling puberty, attempting intercourse but achieving only a half-potent, immature kind of interaction. In the end, Desalvo grew up and cured himself through murder. Brussels concluded, he writes. The last one, Mary Sullivan, was subjected to the final and complete indignity. The semen was in her mouth. The strangler had said symbolically, "I thrown my sex in her face," and where the sex should have been, he scornfully thrust the handle of the broom. I think he has finished. He's been seeking two things: to grow up sexually and to avenge himself for his mother's rejection of him and whatever caused his hang-up. I believe he has succeeded on both counts. With Mary Sullivan, I said, he perpetrated the final indignity, the final revenge. He threw his sex in her face. He used a broom handle to say that her sex no longer troubled him. He scorned it. I think Mary Sullivan may turn out to be his last victim. I think he has, in a way, cured himself of his overtly sexual difficulties, though not of his other emotional problems. Brussels' theory is a fascinating one, but problematic in certain areas. First, Brussels maintains that Desalvo had a negative relationship with his mother. Other sources say the opposite, that Desalvo loved and cherished his mother, and that he was her favourite. If his mother was indifferent, why did she spend 6 months looking for her children after the husband sold them to a farmer? Second, unless Brussels was representing Desalvo's point of view, Brussels perhaps attaches too much of a value judgment on oral sex by referring to it as an indignity and to the vagina as to where the sex should have been. Finally, if Desalvo had been having extensive sex since adolescence and was a prolific seducer, why would he engage in these acts of immature childlike sex, followed by murder? Of course, there is a distant possibility that Desalvo was fantasizing about his sexual exploits. Perhaps women did not throw their jewelry at him in exchange for sex, and perhaps he was not the big bisexual neighbourhood stud muffin he claims he was. The only accounts of Desalvo's sexual history come from Desalvo himself. What if Imgard was his first sexual partner? Canadian anthropologist and serial murder expert Elliot Layton rejects the psychoanalytic model of Albert Desalvo for socio-economic one. Layton points out that Desalvo made numerous statements attesting that he felt he came from very low class status. Like his father, Desalvo married up in class. Imgard came from a respectable European middle-class family, just as Desalvo's mother came from a respectable old middle-class Boston, Yankee-like family in the end. Imgard rejected Desalvo when he was arrested as the measuring man. Desalvo told police, "I've been a poor boy all my life. I come from a bad home. You know that all that. Why should I kid you? Look, I don't know anything about modelling or cameras. I'm not educated, and these girls was all college graduate. Understand me? I made fools of them. I made them do what I wanted and accepted me and listened to me." DeSalvo preyed upon his victims' lower middle class and student like low rise apartments, but DeSalvo, it was a step up. To DeSalvo, it was a step up. He thought of striking in a wealthier neighborhood called Swampscott, but didn't have the confidence. Now, Swampscott is a fancy place with big houses and lots of them. Smart and educated broads like I used to fall over around Harvard Square, but they grew up and got married, and now they got kids. And anyway, I don't want to go to Swampscott because I don't like the way they make me feel like an animal. Those kinds of broads, and that is why I always put something over their faces and eyes so they can't look at me. During his interrogation, DeSalvo turned to be one of the state attorneys and said, "You are a man. You know what I mean. Sure, you have been to them high-class colleges and you got all them big excuses, but you have had that thing in your pants too. I think this is one of the troubles, sir, that guys like you who have played with yourselves, who have looked with the real lust on women, some of them far too young, way out of your range, or possibly with a great deal of lust, are afraid to admit it because somehow it makes you down from the goddamn pedestal on which society places you, but you are only a man. Let me say this, sir, if you who sits across the table from me with such a shocked face, just let me say this. I ain't got nothing to lose in it no more. You should know, and I couldn't give less of a goddamn if for your world, which is a nice society for you as long as you have money. Have you ever thought of what it would be like for your ass if you didn't have dough? I bet you ain't." At one point, DeSalvo suggested that he stop killing because his in-guard treated him better. But even then, he expressed in socioeconomic terms, "My wife was treating me better. I was building up, you might say, my better self, the better side of me. I was very good at my job. They liked me. I got 2 raises." DeSalvo wanted to confess earlier, but according to him, his wife had threatened to commit suicide and kill the children if he confessed to being the Strangler. At some point, DeSalvo began to believe that his wife never really loved him and was kind to him in the last months only because of his increased income. This angered him so much that he confessed to being the Boston Strangler. He told his wife, "Our last 2 months together, you made me feel for the first time like a man. You gave me love I never dreamed you had to give, but why only because I had just about everything you dreamed of. Everything you wanted, house fixed up, all the money coming in." Confession was his revenge. Leighton wrote that in the end, DeSalvo found that he was searching for all those apartments in the last victim's home, the Happy New Year card, the ultimate insult to society, placed at the foot of society's precious young women raped and dead. Whether Brussels' psychoanalytic model for Leighton's socio-economic theory is more valid, we will probably never know. Any hope of further questioning Albert DeSalvo vanished in November 26, 1973, when he was stabbed through the heart in his prison cell. His murder remains unsolved, as does the mystery of exactly why he began killing and why he ceased. Did you enjoy that? If you did, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe and hit the notifications icon so you can see when I've done another video. And
I want you to tell all your friends about me.
until next time, I am Sir Shudder. See you soon. Be safe, be cool.